Hello and welcome to the annual WriteHive conference. This year is packed with a ton of great sessions for writers, writing professionals, and the publishing industry. WriteHive is a nonprofit serving the writing community with free and inclusive resources, events, programming, connections, and more. The 2025 conference brings you this session, LGBTQ plus history in publishing. So let's kick things off by having each of you introduce yourselves, and we'll start with Kristin.
Hello, I'm Kristin Jacques. I am an author of queer fiction, and I am also a queer person. And I am just very interested in this topic because I'm a huge fan of history and how we got here.
Awesome, thank you. And then Paulette.
Hi, I'm Paulette Kennedy, and I write Gothic historical suspense. And I really believe that this is an important topic. All of my books include LGBTQ plus characters. I myself am bisexual, so it's important for me to have that representation in my novels so that my readers can feel seen by my characters.
Awesome. And Megan?
Hi, everyone. I'm Megan. I'm a former literary agent and currently a freelance editor. This topic is really important to me as a queer person myself. And one of the big things that I did when I was building my list as an agent was try to showcase a lot of queer and marginalized authors and get their stories told, and had, a mixed bag of both positive reception and other not so good reception. So this topic is just important, especially in publishing as a whole, which is why I'm very interested in being here today. So thank you, everyone.
Great. And I'm Dawn Vogel. I'm the moderator, and I am also a writer and editor of fiction that almost entirely includes some sort of queer representation. And I am also bisexual, and so also a historian, which is another reason why this topic's so interesting to me. All right, so we're going to kick this off with the first question, which is, what have been some recurring themes or topics in English language LGBTQ plus literature over time? And we'll start with Megan this time.
It's a great question because the LGBTQ literature has definitely changed over time. Like if we think of, older authors from 1900s, 1800s, a lot of themes of sort of self-discovery or queerness were kind of hidden in undertones, like there's Emily Dickinson, for example, writing love letters to her sister-in-law, but or these very passionate sort of I would die without you, or my heart would be without you, it was a lot more veiled and concealed and tucked away. And just as modern literature has changed and shifted, we've seen a lot of themes also emerge. So I would say some of the key ones are definitely the exploration of the self and love. And if I think about it in say a YA context, it'll be the first time you're thinking about this, or the first time you're falling in love. And especially when you realize that it's not part of the heteronormative culture that you've kind of been expected to be a part of. Also, I think about feelings of not really feeling enough, not queer enough, not good enough. And I think especially of identities like bisexuality or asexuality, where those tend to get pigeonholed or forgotten about, or they're not good enough, especially if they're presented a certain way. Homophobia and bullying obviously are very big as well, whether it's how you deal with it or just experiencing it as part of queer culture. And I feel a lot of older literature, that was kind of almost the default. If there was a gay character, there's someone who's being bullied or experiencing that. And it's been nice to see in some more modern literature kind of pushing back and kind of setting a little bit more of a standard for that sort of thing. And I think another big one is just subverting gender and sexuality expectations. That's at the heart of a lot of books, and kind of what does it look like to be different? How does that register to other people, or the relationships that are key to you? And another one that I had here was just queerness and family structures, how families are able to deal with it, how you're able to present it. Are they accepting or not? Can you have this blood family, or rather, I feel a lot of queer people who turn towards the found family, and those are some big themes. So it's been nice to kind of see this transition where it can be a little bit more explicit and out there for people who are looking for it and need to see it.
Great. Kristin, what about you?
Yeah, one of the themes that I saw that kind of evolved over time, especially when you're thinking of mid 20th century queer literature, is the exploration of self-imposed self-hatred that was explored in Baldwin's novels and that kind of thing, and holding up that mirror to today's queer fiction. We're allowing stories of self-love and finding joy And that's just such a wonderful tonal shift. And like really, we didn't see that almost until like the 21st century.
Paulette, any others you want to add?
Well, I think Kristin and Megan have covered most everything that I was going to talk about. It's been great to hear their insights. But just echoing what Kristin said, in a lot of early fiction, we see a lot of reconciliation of the internal struggle of realizing your queerness and how that manifests outwardly. In the novelization, especially, I'm thinking of The Picture of Dorian Gray, especially. That's one of the books where you see that kind of externalization of internalized homophobia come out, because Wilde had to be so closeted because it was a crime to be gay. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of that. But I think now, thankfully, we're getting to a point to where self-acceptance, even though there is still that process of self-discovery that happens in coming of age fiction, and that's part of coming out, is the self-acceptance is more on the surface in a lot of modern queer fiction, and that really helps especially younger people when they read queer fiction to see themselves and to accept themselves. And I think it's really important, and found family is so important in queer fiction, because a lot of times, especially speaking for myself, being from a very conservative area, we don't necessarily lose our families, our blood families, but sometimes our relationships have a lot more friction in them during our whole process of coming out. And having found family and friends in the queer community and having that represented in fiction is really helpful and a great theme.
All right. So our next question is, who are some important figures in LGBTQ plus publishing history in the English language? And Paulette, we'll start with you this time.
Well, of course, Oscar Wilde, Bram Stoker. Of course, there's a lot of bisexual subtext in Dracula. I've recently reread it and it's all there. And Joseph Sheridan, Le Fanu, gosh, there's so many. And, speaking of like the Victorian era into the 20th century, we have Virginia Woolf, we have E.M. Forster, we have like these early authors who were learning about their own queerness through writing about their characters. And later on, Truman Capote, there are just so many important figures in early LGBTQ plus literature, queer literature. But there's a lot of queer subtext and from books and authors who weren't necessarily out or maybe didn't realize they were queer. I'm a big fan of Shirley Jackson's work and Daphne du Maurier's work. There is a lot of gender stuff in Daphne's work, especially. There's a lot of queer coded characterization in Jackson's work. And I think while we can only conjecture about their identities, there's a lot of subtext and a lot of early American and English literature that leads us to think about these things.
Right. Megan, anybody you want to add to that list?
Well, Paulette, you definitely took a handful of mine, but I will put in a few other ones that I had here. When I think about sort of earlier LGBTQ publishing, I think of Audre Lorde, especially, who was a big pioneer of not even just queerness, but Blackness as well on top of that, and that intersectionality, which has become very crucial for a lot of just like later gender sexuality studies. So definitely have to mention her. I mentioned Emily Dickinson before, and kind of doing it through a poetry lens, which is like, I think some poetry is really, really gay, and that's just like, but you can cover it in like flowers and pretty language sometimes. It's just kind of funny to explore that. I also had James Baldwin and Roxane Gay on here as well, like these kind of big figures who allowed us to kind of get further by being so just like forward and writing down a lot of these things and giving us that. In a more like modern LGBTQ, I think of like YA publishing. I think of authors like Anna Marie McLemore, who's like a non-binary trans like Latin author who's done a lot of like retellings of like Great Gatsby and I think like Sleeping Beauty and all this stuff, but like through this very different lens. I think of Adam Silvera, another like Latin gay man who has written, you know, opened up the genre as well. And I think of Case and Calendar as well for Felix Ever After and having like one of the most popular like YA books centering like a trans Black man or a Black teenager. And all of these things like, you know, couldn't have come without all the people before it. So those are the people on my list.
Awesome. Kristin, do you have folks to add?
I've just got a couple authors that didn't get mentioned yet, that are outside the US. Like Mary Renault, who I was talking to you earlier about, who was a British author and writing in like the 1950s. And she wrote historical queer novels where it was very normalized, and she couldn't even get some of her novels published in the US until like almost the end of the 50s because, you know, fear of persecution, like The Charioteer. And then there was author Jane Rule, who is a Canadian author who wrote The Desert of the Heart, which was a positive lesbian novel that was published in like the 1960s and even had a cult classic film made in the 80s, like 20 years later. And it was just like, it was like one of the prime examples that I think of queer joy during that time. Like they had a happy ending and like very modern like themes and ahead of its time.
Yeah, I also, you know, just sort of looking at some of the time frames that we're talking about and knowing sort of other historical things going on, like the Hays Code in Hollywood and things like that. And so having people publishing, even if Hollywood was saying, oh no, we can't have happily ever afters for any queer characters. Yeah. All right. So our next question is, what barriers have existed in English language LGBTQ plus publishing throughout history, and how were they broken down and or who broke them down? Kristin, we'll start with you for this.
I think a lot of the issues that came with publishing in LGBTQ fiction had to do with a lot of the conservative and Puritan roots that, you know, dogged the publishing world for like ever, because that's where America's roots are, is in Puritanism and conservatism. And unfortunately, that also, they're from England too, where they have a huge conservative background. And so a lot of it was overcoming those issues involved. And, you know, one of the big things that happened was the Stonewall riots in the 1960s. And it was a big turning point and kind of had a cascade effect in other countries where, like, you know, more rights were being pushed and, you know, barriers were breaking down.
Awesome. Paulette?
Yeah, everything that Kristin said, absolutely. And also to the politicization, as she mentioned, about being queer and how that becomes a political talking point. We see this even still today. But, you know, for a long time, queerness was considered a mental illness. And it wasn't until the 20th century that it was taken out late in the 20th century, I believe, out of the DSM-4 criteria for mental illness. And so that is a big barrier. Just having queerness become more normalized and more widespread representation happening. There's always been a push against that. And as Kristin mentioned, our Puritan roots and how religion has been a big factor in the founding of the country and whatnot. I think that is a huge factor even today. And just the 20th century's society's heteronormative expectations. And you mentioned the Hays Code and how, especially after World War II, it was considered patriotic to have that classic nuclear American family. And women were encouraged to have babies and to do all of these things in order to stabilize the country. And we see the CIA getting involved with Hollywood and all of the things that were happening to put forth an image of what the ideal was, and queer people did not fit into that ideal. And so that was a huge barrier in media.
And Megan?
Yeah, these are all great points. And, we couldn't have definitely gotten to this point without these big changes. Some of the things that I have here, or I'm thinking about, publishing specifically and how that's changed. So I think some barriers that have existed is, queer people having to justify why their book should be picked up or bought by editors. And even further than that, just like sometimes if queer books didn't fit into a heteronormative expectation in publishing, like having to mold those books, or like, oh, I don't understand what this sexuality is, so like I don't know what I can do with it. When I was an agent, I had an author who wrote a like a gay rom-com, and I had seen like a call out for rom-coms from an imprint. So I submitted it, and within about like, I don't know, a day, I got a response being like, oh, we already have a book like this. That's it. And I was just like, all right, I can promise you that they're different, but all right, fine, and I think how these have gotten broken down, like they still exist. And I think this is going to be a challenge almost indefinitely, but I think exposure is kind of one thing. So, having LGBTQ like initiative sites, like I think about LGBTQ reads, I think about diversity and YA, these places that are bringing it more to the forefront and bringing exposure and like trying to change publishing from within. And I also think about hiring more queer editors and making imprints more inclusive. Like I think of Rick Riordan Presents, which is, for fantasy, and obviously is not just centered on queerness, but like having big name people be like, yes, we're going to do these things, like opens doors for other people, because it's like, well, you're not going to turn down Rick Riordan. You're not going to turn down like someone who's big, but we can like reach down and pull people up. And so I feel like that's what's changed a lot. And I hope it continues to.
I agree. We also have sort of the flip side of that question, which is what barriers still exist today. And Megan, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest one that I think is probably on everyone's minds is just censorship. And in this current climate of books, LGBTQ books being pulled from shelves, being considered pornography, even to some extreme cases of like book burning as like a statement, and it's very reminiscent of, 1930s, 1940s Germany, where if anything was deemed not acceptable, there was pushback against that. And I think that's really the hardest thing to combat, because, if you think about how much publishing relies on sort of getting the word out or having the space in libraries or having all these connections, if these books can't get there or they're being scrutinized and politicized, that is a big challenge that has a lot necessary to overcome it. And, we have that big lawsuit where all the big 5 publishers are trying to challenge the censorship stuff. And I'm very happy that that is happening, but it's a big problem and it's with no easy solution.
Kristin, what about any others that you can think of, or do you want to talk more on that?
That's kind of where my thoughts are, is like our biggest problem right now is like this rising ideology that's happening, and just having to fight back and push back against that. It's kind of affecting everything across the board. And it's not just even the ideology, it's the financial aspect of the uncertainty that's in the air right now, and the fact that sales are down across the board. So it's even harder for us to justify pushing out certain novels. And it's a very complex ball of issues that where people are just kind of like going through the minefield of publishing right now. And it's 10 times harder in some areas, especially for people on the minority end and people in like the queer end, and just trying to exist.
Mm-hmm. And Paulette?
Just to add, I saw the ALA list of books that were most banned and challenged, and almost all of them on that list were by queer authors, most of them by queer authors of color. And so that is a huge issue, as mentioned before, the politicization of queerness, the conflating queerness, queer identity with morality. And that is hugely problematic. And also touching on what Megan said about queer quotas in publishing. Oh, we already have a queer book, so we don't need to add more. And it's like, but we're not a monolith and every voice is different. And we all deserve to have a platform. And so I think that those are the things that queer authors are having to confront. And also just like how we write our stories is, it's a little scary right now. It's like, do we just be more overt, or do we use more metaphor? And hopefully censorship won't get to the point to where we have to change how we write in order to get our message across. But it's something that a lot of queer author friends of mine and I are talking about. It's like, how far can we go in the future?
Go ahead,
I was
Kristin.
gonna add one more thing, that like building on what Paulette said, like it's also a matter of like the fact that our identities are also under attack with the current ideology that's on the rise. And as I was saying, like it's getting a little scary to exist in this and also create. And the fact that there's so much pressure with AI in the mix too, and just like there's a lot happening.
Yeah, no, there is so much happening right now. All right, let's try to turn it to a more positive topic here, and that is, how has LGBTQ plus literature impacted American and or English-speaking culture at large? Paulette, we'll start with you.
I think ultimately any kind of fiction coming from a marginalized group or marginalized voices helps inspire empathy. And I think that that is one of the biggest positives out there about writing our experiences through the lives of our characters, is it helps other people who are like us feel seen. And whenever I'm approaching my work and whenever I'm appreciating other people's work, those are the impacts that really stay with me. And I feel like on culture as a whole, like even though things are scary right now and seem to be regressing in some ways, we have come so far about being able to be expressive of our identities. And, you know, I grew up in the 80s and I grew up during the AIDS crisis and all of these things that were impacting the queer community on a high level in a negative way. And just how far we've come as a society. I never thought that we would be able to see gay marriage legalized, for example. So all of these things that like enable us to show queer people living their lives, loving one another and existing, I think that those are the big positives.
Megan?
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with what Paulette said. And I think that ultimately you can't really understand society or people without encompassing everybody in the conversation. And that is what LGBTQ literature has done. I think about when I was younger and I was a very avid reader and I didn't really see a lot of queer representation, or if I did, it was mostly like gay men, for example. Like that was kind of the only thing that you can kind of talk about. And there were like some lesbian fiction that was like even further down and mostly harmful. And I remember when sort of like YA and started taking this shift where we were getting more queer characters, more female like protagonists. And I just started to see like this influx of a bunch of different queer authors writing about, first love, discovery, kind of all of these themes that we talked about before. And I remember just kind of thinking to myself, like, oh, I understand myself better, right? I can see the things that I didn't have words for, the tools for. And ultimately, like LGBTQ literature has given people access to maybe more of themselves or an understanding of other people. And I think, books are one of those things that can teach a lot and create empathy and creativity. And we kind of need those things in society in general. And so having being able to go to a store now and see like LGBTQ fiction is amazing. That just wasn't really a thing. Like I remember it was just children's books, adult, sci-fi, fantasy, and then like manga or something, or graphic novels, right? And now we have a broader spectrum. And I think that's just necessary, but I think it allows people to see themselves and know that there's a future and that there's a possibility maybe outside of what they may know. Like I think about conservative households, or maybe just like non-accepting families, or people who are on their own, like, or they didn't realize they were queer until they were older and they don't know what to do. Like everyone's journey is important. And that's what LGBTQ literature, I feel like, has made the biggest difference in.
And Kristin?
For me, it was seeing how it's become mainstream almost, because like I remember growing up in the 90s and like even in the early aughties where if there was a queer character, they were often fridged. Looking at you, Joss Whedon.
Hmm.
And just thinking of like I could not imagine something like Arcane existing when I was younger. Or I could not imagine like any of like the beautiful stories like that exist now existing when I was younger, and just like how far it's come and how it's almost been normalized or at least accepted as something that can be out and normal and not like as hidden away as it used to be.
Yeah, the other thing that I was thinking of when you said fridged, Kristin, was the, queer-coded villains was such a big thing, and we're moving away from that, thankfully. And that actually segues nicely into our next question, which is how has queer representation in the English language been different between LGBTQ plus authors and cis straight authors, and their portrayals? Kristin, we'll start with you.
Oh, I'm not good with this one. um I think as you were saying, like from a lot of authors who wrote queer coded villains, versus, when you have an author who might be writing a queer villain, it's just different. The representation's a little different, more genuine. Like you can have a person who is queer still be a villain, but that is not their entire identity. They are not a villain because they are queer.
I totally agree with what Kristin was saying. I think sometimes there's nuance lacking, and that's the issue. If a writer is not doing their due diligence and talking to queer people before they write a character who could be problematic and is also queer. I don't have a problem personally with queer villains as long as they're done well. One of my very favorite queer villains is Alexis Henderson's Elizabeth in The House of Hunger. I think that character is really well done. And I think it really just depends on how you approach the subject matter, because right now it is a matter of like showing ourselves in a way that doesn't get weaponized by people who want to use our identity against us. So we have to go in doing it with subtlety. And also, I just want to say that we can't always be sure that a writer is straight. And that's something I was closeted for years.
Mm-hmm.
And it was still coming out in my work. And it's one of those things that just because someone might seem to be cis het, maybe they are questioning their identity and maybe they're not ready to come out. And so I think that when you see a supposedly straight cisgender writer writing someone who is queer, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing that from a level of inexperience. So just my 2 cents.
Oh, absolutely. I hear you on that. Megan?
Yeah, I'm to Paulette's point too, I also think about if an author isn't out too, like it could also just blatantly be a safety issue. They're in a situation where maybe their family's not good, their partner, maybe, who knows, like everyone goes through something different. But I think about that. And when I think about this question more, I think about just kind of some of the differences that queer authors have to go through versus het authors. Like I think the blatant one is like justifying sexuality, like if there's let's just do like a regular het romance, right? You don't need to spend pages going, oh my God, I'm straight and I feel this way towards men. And that's like, you just don't do that. But in queer literature, especially if I think in the more like negative terms, like people almost expect that, like a lesson in some way through the justification of sexuality. And, this extends to other marginalized identities as well. But this one thing that I definitely see that's very different. And I also think about too how sometimes when cis authors do write queer characters, like you can tell that they're either just there to support the main character or they lean more into the tropey side where they're like hyper feminine or they're like hypersexual, right? Which are like, of course, those things can be true for some queer people, but like that's not every person looks like that or acts like that, but they've cut, there is falling into that trap as well. And I think about probably the most famous one that we might all know is Bury Your Gays, where it's like you'll have you know, full-fledged like queer character, and you know, ideally, and then suddenly they just die for no reason, and you're like, okay, but why? And Kristin, when you were talking about Joss Whedon, that's immediately what I thought about, because I'm still not over what happened in Buffy, and I don't think I ever will be. And I just recently rewatched Buffy too, and I was just like, this is so much worse. Like, it's so much worse. But you know, like, these are just different things that like don't happen, you know, when you're writing from like a heterosexual lens, or like you have to bring it to a publisher. Like these are the main differences in the tropes and stuff that I see for these two types of books.
I don't think anybody's ever going to forgive Joss for Buffy or countless other things, but yeah.
No.
All right. And so the last question that we have is, why is it important to remember English language LGBTQ plus publishing history? Megan, we'll start with you.
I think, you know, talking about some of the stuff that we've all iterated here, like, you know, being in this time, especially of censorship and justification of a lot of identity through this like political lens, I think we can't ever really forget where we come from and like all the things that allowed us to get here. Because, you know, Paulette was mentioning this earlier, like we don't want to go back to a regression. We don't want to go to this point where we're hiding or doing like availing our identities or trying to like get out of like the mainstream lens, because that's just dangerous, and it's, you know, just honestly disrespectful to everybody who's come before us and put their like bodies, lives, minds on the line for us to be here. And I think if we choose to forget, or we choose to fall back into some of these more toxic patterns, we're erasing progress, we're erasing people, and that's just not something that I will ever be comfortable with, and I'm sure everybody else here is the same way. So it's important to remember where you come from, the mistakes that have been made along the way, the people who have like held us up, and ultimately like how can we move forward through these times of, you know, extreme just like fear and fear mongering and, you know, like political kind of tension that we have right now. So we like, it's just important because we exist and we need to be here, and we can't ever forget that.
Yeah, to add on to what Megan was saying, like it, especially in this climate, it's you can see how fast and how quickly things can backslide if people are not vigilant and pushing back. And you know, there's been a lot of, especially right around the regime shift, as it were. There was a lot of chatter about how writing shouldn't be political, but writing is inherently political, and that's especially true when your identity becomes a political issue. So it's more important than ever to remember like the history, especially in America. Queerness has always been political.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And Paulette?
Yes, adding on to what Kristin and Megan saying, art is political. All art is political, even if it doesn't seem to be on the outside, it is. And I think that it's important for us to, you know, reframe the queer experience and also honor our history. But also, like, it's part of our advocacy and part of our resistance to continue to write our experiences, and the queer experience is very important, and it's part of history, and queer people have always existed. And it's important for heteronormative people to see that. It's important for them to have that presented to them. And a lot of my readers are straight, and they still enjoy seeing queer representation on the page because they might have family members or friends who are queer. And so while it's important for our queer family to see themselves represented, it's also important for other people to see queer characters and queer stories.
Absolutely. All right, so we're going to finish up with a one last round from each of our panelists. Please let our audience know where they can find you online, and if you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share. We'll start with Paulette.
You can find me online at my website, paulettekennedy.com. I have a very active newsletter, which I put out every month. That's my main way of staying in communication with my readers. And I'm also on Instagram at pkennedywrites. And I want to just say this is such a great topic, and thank you so much for having me. And I'm just so grateful that we have queer stories in the world, and I hope that they continue forever.
Great, thank you. Megan, how about you?
You can find me on Threads at Written Megan and writtenmeg.bluesky.social. My freelance website, it's meganmanzano12.wixsite.com/meg-edits. And echoing sort of a similar sentiment, this is a really important topic that I think we need to continue to talk about. And it was great to be invited here and just, really shed some light on some key issues in LGBTQ publishing and just at large. So thank you very much for having me. This is wonderful.
Excellent. And finally, Kristin.
Yeah, you can find me on Threads and Instagram at Crazy Diamond Writes. And you can also find me on the interwebs, KristinJacques.com. And I'm just really happy to be here. I really think it's important, as I said, to remember our roots and to continue pushing back in publishing and continue to create queer stories.
Excellent. And I'm again Dawn Vogel. You can find me online at historythatneverwas.com. And I'm generally on the socials as History Never Was because of character limitations. So I want to say thank you to all three of our wonderful panelists, and thank you to the audience for watching our panel about LGBTQ plus history in publishing. If you're looking for more content similar to this topic, there are a lot of writehive panels from past conferences that have featured this topic, but I just wanted to specifically call out LGBTQ plus traditional versus self-publishing from 2024. How LGBTQ plus rep has changed fiction from 2023, and also a panel on book banning and censorship from 2023. But you can also find a lot of other really great panels about LGBTQ representation in various genres, all available on writehive's YouTube channel. So thank everyone for watching, and enjoy the rest of the conference.